Almost every time Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, is mentioned by the media, his prospects as a leading Republican candidate for the 2024 presidential race are also mentioned. They usually put it this way: he's considered a potential rival to Donald Trump. He's widely being discussed as a potential candidate, and so on, even though they rarely get around to telling us who's doing the considering or the discussing. So let's take a look for a minute about what seems to be perfectly acceptable behavior for a potential Republican frontrunner for president in 2024. First of all, we have the Woke Act, which stands for Stop the Wrongs to Our Kids and Employees. This act takes on corporate wokeness. Your guess is as good as mine because I have no idea what the fuck that is. And it also prohibits the teaching of critical race theory in Florida public schools. By the way, as many of you already know, critical race theory is an advanced legal theory that is not taught in public schools anywhere. We also have the recent Don't Say Gay bill, which just today was passed by the Florida State Senate. This essentially makes it not illegal exactly, but prohibited for Florida teachers to discuss LGBTQ issues, gender, sexual orientation with students younger than grade 4, I believe. It's almost certain that DeSantis is going to pass this bill. And just recently, his press secretary, whose name I believe is Christina Pashaw, which is kind of funny, she recently said that if you're against what she called the anti-grooming bill, you're probably a groomer, or at least you don't denounce the grooming of 4 to 8-year-old children. Let that sink in for a second. She's saying explicitly that if you think it's wrong to prevent teachers from discussing gender and issues of sexual orientation with their students, it makes you a pedophile, or at least somebody who's very comfortable with pedophiles. Now, this is just a way of changing the subject, because the truth of the matter is the quote unquote Don't Say Gay bill is incredibly dangerous. It puts LGBTQ plus children at great risk for bullying, self-harm, and suicide. But of course, they don't care. Adam Serwer said, I believe back in 2019, that the cruelty is the point. Well, it also appears to be a necessary prerequisite to become a Republican presidential candidate. But that's not all. In Florida, over 71,000 Floridians have died from COVID-19. That's a lot of people, obviously. And you could say, well, you know, at the beginning, we didn't know, we weren't sure what to do, we didn't have vaccines. But the truth of the matter is, Florida had its largest spike of COVID cases and deaths 6 months after the vaccine became readily available. That's right. 6 months after a free, effective, readily available vaccine to combat COVID-19 came into existence, Florida had its highest count of COVID cases and COVID deaths. Many of those people died unnecessarily because Governor DeSantis fancies himself a tough guy. He thinks that somehow wearing masks and social distancing and not wanting to get sick and die, or not wanting to make your children sick or die, somehow makes you a wimp. DeSantis has been getting an assist from his seemingly insane Surgeon General, a guy named Joseph Ladapo, who is against mask mandates and vaccine mandates. He opposes school closures, and just a couple of days ago said that healthy children should not get the COVID vaccine. Which begs the question, why hasn't his medical degree been revoked? Also, DeSantis recently bullied a bunch of school children into taking their masks off during a talk he was giving. He didn't ask them or encourage them, as the mainstream media would have you believe. He mocked and bullied them because, again, apparently, being a bully is yet another criterion for success in the Republican Party. So I wonder, is being a homophobic, white supremacist, anti-science, mass murderer what it takes to be a contender for the Republican nomination? Sorry, that was just a rhetorical question. Of course it is. Those are all apparent preconditions for running in 2024. If that's what Republican voters want, then I suppose there's nothing we can do about it. If the Republican leadership has no problem with DeSantis being the nominee, and why should they? I mean, they were perfectly cool with Donald, who in some ways was worse. There's nothing we can do about that either. But how many people will find DeSantis an acceptable nominee simply because the media present him without any context, as if he's already a reasonable contender for the nomination? It's a variation on the same problem we see in the way they treat Donald and his 2024 status. They weigh the possibility of whether or not he's going to run instead of giving us all of the reasons he shouldn't be allowed to. Will Donald run? Is DeSantis a contender? And that's the problem. They keep asking the wrong fucking questions. Before I introduce my guests, I just want all of you to know that starting this Thursday at 7:00 p.m. Eastern Time, my show is going to be live on the Politicon YouTube channel. The link will be in the show notes as well. So make sure you like and follow us, again, on the Politicon YouTube channel, and click the bell. That way you're going to get alerted every time we have a new live show coming. Now let's get to it. Today, I am so excited to welcome my next guest, Elie Mystal, who is the justice correspondent for The Nation magazine, his columns are excellent and not to be missed, but also the author of the very recently published Allow Me to Retort, A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution, which we're going to talk a lot about because, not just because it's brilliantly written, but because the subject matter could not be more timely. I mean, I guess you could say that about the subject matter of this book at any point in this nation's history, but particularly now. Elie, welcome. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Mary. How are you?
I never know how to answer that question anymore. Because how are we, given the fact that the news isn't slowing down, or I should say the horrible news isn't slowing down. No respite.
Right. No, it's funny. I have one part of my brain that's like, oh, I'm trying to promote this book and like it's new and whatever. The other part of my brain is just like, oh yeah, but it's not as important as thermonuclear war. That's I understand why I'm getting bumped, because.
Yeah, or 2 million refugees, or
right, like the global humanitarian crisis. Like things are always happening in the craziness of 2022. But I try not to lose sight of the fact that as bad as things are, they're better than they were 3 years ago. I mean, the whole. It hasn't exactly been like Biden boring. Now I can go to sleep. But let's not forget, people. At 5 or 6 o'clock on Friday, it's okay to turn off the computer, right? And that was not what was happening, circa 2017, 2018, right? Where Friday is no longer the time where you try to turn off the computer and you wake up, you have to come back on because somebody, some constitutional issue has been ignored, somebody's been fired, right. Somebody has drawn a Sharpie on a hurricane projection. That's not happening. And so I try to appreciate that.
Yeah, that is true. But I also feel in some ways that things are worse than they were a year ago. A year ago. There was this period of time where I think a lot of us, not all of us by any stretch of the imagination, but a lot of us did think that although things wouldn't magically get 100% better as soon as Biden got sworn in, but they would get better. And I'm not so sure that's the case. I don't know. What's your take on that?
I don't know. I think my version of what you're saying is the complacency. Right. So I felt like after he was elected, and especially after the insurrection, after the failed coup attempt, there was a lot of energy of like, we're going to fix things. Right. And that has the air has gone out of that balloon. That is kind of completely dissipated. And while we have, I think, successfully achieved, as I was saying before, a level of normalcy, a level of sustainability, it is far and away we are not fixing the core problems. And as we get into another election cycle, all of those problems are going to come back up, and I think potentially really bite us in the behind because we haven't used this opportunity to structurally fix things. Instead, we've used it to again get ourselves the weekends back, and again that's a good thing. But we haven't done the work, and one thing that you always know is that the bad guys never take a day off, right? The bad guys never never sleep, right? And so like they've been working this entire time. The forces that tried to overthrow the government never stopped trying to overthrow the government. And the successes that they have reaped over the last 2 years, I think is going to come back to bite us in the midterms, certainly, and then potentially in 2024.
Well, I think part of the problem is that the chaos and division they soak gives us energy, and it totally demoralizes and enervates the rest of us because we're actually humans who care about stuff. We have empathy, and it's understandable that people were just needed a break. However, one of the things that drives me crazy is that not just everyday people, but the media and even a lot of Democrats act like the Biden administration is a normal administration that followed another normal administration when nothing could be further from the truth.
Yeah, I mean depending on the day of the week, I'm either more pissed at Democrats or more pissed at media. I think right now I'm in a more pissed at Democrats phase because I feel like there are things that I feel like one of the ways the media is able to get away with what they do is that Democrats have not done a great job of making the sale and making the argument and keeping the things that are important top of mind, right? So like, I don't know how you go through, for instance, an entire State of the Union address without bringing up the insurrection, without bringing up that there are people in that chamber who aided and abetted the insurrection, without bringing up the fact that the people who are trying to figure out what happened during the insurrection are not being cooperated with by leave of the Republican Party. I don't see how you go through that would have been, for me, it would have been Ukraine, and then a one-to-one connection between fighting the authoritarians in Eastern Europe and fighting the authoritarians in Washington, D.C. I don't know how he didn't do that, so I'm a little bit annoyed by that. But you have me back on in 2 weeks, and I'll probably be annoyed at the media, which knows full well what the stakes are and doesn't seem to care. Like I don't understand why it's so difficult for certain news organizations or particular publications to have a pro-democracy focus in their coverage, and we see it with Ukraine. Like we don't see a lot of both sides BS when it comes to telling the difference between a country that's trying to have self-determination and an aggressive foreign adversary. Suddenly, a lot of these people are pro-democracy again. But why can't they be pro-democracy at home? And why can't they be pro-democracy in their coverage at home? But they're not. But they're not, and they seem to get away with it at all times. So, like I said, a couple of weeks I'll be back to being pissed at the media.
But I think we could be pissed at both entities all the time. I mean, I kind of have although that too would be really exhausting, but we can try. I have a policy, generally speaking, of not criticizing the Biden administration or Dems simply because the media are so biased in their coverage. Donald versus Biden, Democrats, the Democratic Party as a whole versus
Democrats
the
in
Republican Party.
disarray. That's their favorite.
I'm sorry?
That's their favorite story. Democrats in disarray.
Yes, Dems in disarray. Yeah, exactly. And, generally what we're talking about now is that 96% of Democrats in the Senate are united, but it's still Dems in disarray. When it comes to criticizing the Democratic Party, though, you just wrote a great article called Yes, Black Voters Feel Let Down by Biden. And the two major things you point to that I think we do need to keep hammering on are the failures to protect voting rights in a vociferous, vehement, passionate way, and the failures in at least even addressing the problems with police corruption and violence towards Black Americans. How do we explain that? And I think you and I can explain it, but I think it's hard for people to understand that those two failures exist in a larger context. So can you talk about that a little bit?
So one of the let's start at this point, since you brought up, I think the good and decent point that you want to try to not exactly ignore, but hold your fire a little bit, because the coverage in the media is generally so one-sided. But so let's start here for explaining why I'm not holding my fire on this particular issue. Right? Polls that I have seen have Biden somewhere around 67% support. With African Americans in this country. That is an unsustainable number for a Democratic candidate, right? You cannot win an election to national dog catcher with 66% of the Black vote if you're a Democrat. You just can't get it done. Right? Biden was won the election 87, 88% of Black vote. Now he's at 66%. So he's lost 20% of the Black electorate, right? He has to fix that or he ain't gonna win again. So I focus on some of these issues because I'm trying to figure out, well, where have you lost 20% of the Black electorate? And so that's where I come to, did you lose 20% of the Black electorate because they were worried that you weren't gonna fund police enough? Is that really where we think the problem was? Because I don't think that's where the problem is. All right. So I focus on things like police brutality and the failure of the Biden administration to federally address police brutality. I focus on things like voting rights. I focus on the things that Black people and Black activists have been asking for because I have to believe that the failure to deliver on those things is a big reason why Biden has lost 20% of the Black vote. There are other things that Biden has done for African American communities, for communities of color, that I think are good. Asian American hate crimes bill, that was a good thing. I think that it's unquestionable he's had the most diverse cabinet in American history, including more than the first Black president did. Right? He's made a diverse selection of lower court federal judges. He's nominated, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, the first Black woman to the Supreme Court. He has a story to tell. I just tweeted when we're recording this, the day that we're recording this, I tweeted that the breakdown of his historic funding of historically Black colleges and universities. $2.7 billion for these institutions of higher learning. He has successes. But I'm old enough to remember when Black people spent a whole summer in the street in the middle of a pandemic, desperately demanding immediate redress of police brutality and demanding justice, and Biden has done nothing. I'm old enough to remember when Black people delivered the Senate to Democrats by putting 2 Democrats into the Senate from the state of Georgia. And what we asked for was the protection of the voting rights for those people. And Biden and the Democrats have done nothing to protect those voting rights. And so I feel like that's where the 20% went, right? That's where he lost. That's where he lost the people. And B, if he doesn't get those people back, he can't win. So I focus on
Right.
this.
Yeah, but also because this isn't new. How many more decades and centuries can Democratic leadership say to Black Americans in particular, we'll get you eventually. Just keep putting us in power and we'll get you eventually. But, we don't want to really get into the whole critical race theory, even though it's really fucking racist, because we don't want to upset suburban white swing voters, which, by the way, exist in the same numbers as unicorns. We don't want to scare people off by doing what needs to be done, and by implying that the rights of Americans can be deferred. They're also sending the message that it doesn't really count for the majority of Americans, which is absurd. Biden's whole thing in the State of the Union was a unity message. And as you said earlier, the one thing that I think should unite almost all of us, except the seditionists, is what happened on January 6th. The one thing that should unite all of us who care about the potential for American democracy is voting rights for all people. So it's that failure that kind of drives us up the wall.
100%. You say it's not new. Like it's that thing where again, I think a good way of looking at it is, what do the Republicans do, right? When Republicans get in power, the first thing they do is throw red meat to their base, right?
Right.
You get elected Republican. I don't care if it's president, mayor, governor, anybody in between. The first thing you do if you're a Republican, you go find some vulnerable group, usually with brown skin, to make fun of, right? You go find somebody in the LGBTQ community to terrorize, to harass, right? Like that's the first thing you do to pay off the base of your voters, right? They elected you to be bigoted and misogynist and cruel, and so you go off and you find somebody to be bigoted or misogynist or cruel to as a good faith effort to show that those base voters got what they wanted. Where's the Democrat version? Where is the Democrats paying off their base voters, right? Because unlike cruelty, what Democratic base voters want is justice. So where's the justice? Where's the perp walk? Where's the rapacious capitalist criminal who's being perp walked into the courthouse? Where's the insurrectionist funder who's being tried for treason? Where's the justice? Where's the fairness? Where's that outreach to the base voter that put them in office? Running towards the center and trying to compete for gettable voters, that has to happen too. I'm not, naive. I understand what an election year is all about. You always want to try to tack towards the center in an election year. That's fine. But where's that payoff to the base? Because we haven't seen it. I don't know what the policy is that I'm supposed to point to as like, oh, that's the base voter policy, right? Because the infrastructure bill, the American Rescue Plan, the Build Back Better stuff, that benefits everybody. That's center mass politics, and that's great. I'm not disparaging that kind of stuff, but that's not what the hardcore I show up every election people. That's not what they were out in the streets for. So
Right.
Where's their payoff? And you don't see it, and you generally don't see it with Democrats. That's an ace. There are many asymmetrical wars that Democrats fight, and this is one of them. Democrats are always basically afraid of their base. Republicans are always embrace their base. They might be lying to their base. They might not. Republicans don't actually help a lot of the people who are in the base in any real way. There's rarely policy or legislation that base wants, but there's always cultural embrace. They hold that base close tightly, and they're, well, you and me, we're the same. They always do that for them, make them feel superior and stuff. And so I never know where that is for the Democrats, but I always try to fight for it. Because there's so many people. They're like, what would you have Biden do? No, there are things that he could do. There are things that I want him to do. This is not, you've alluded to it. Mansion and cinema, or cinema and mansion, or the people behind those two that we never talk about because they're taking all the heat. Because I'm sure that, look, if Democrats, just be real with yourselves. If Sinema and Manchin got raptured tomorrow, Chris Coons and Dianne Feinstein would rise and take their place. Like we
They
know
would indeed.
how that rolls, right? There's always a centrist, and there's always a Joe Lieberman somewhere, in this party willing to screw everything up, right? So, but there's
did you have to say that name? Oh, sorry.
Right?
Got chills down my spine.
Right? But there's still things that Biden could do, and I want him to do those things.
And again, the problem is in how things are positioned and the language that you, and sometimes it seems like a superficial thing, but I think it is not. Republicans co-opt Democrats' language to undermine Democrats. Democrats co-opt or parrot Republicans' language to help Republicans, like using woke to criticize members of their own party or whatever, which is absurd. But then the other thing that extends beyond that is this assumption that the bases are somehow equal. So the Republicans cater to its base. We wish the Democrats would not just cater to, but empower its base. The difference is the Democratic base is, as you said, full of people who want health care for everybody, who want voting rights for everybody, who want cops to stop killing innocent black people. I don't understand how that's not a centrist position. The Republican, and it's not, clearly, the Republican base is a bunch of white supremacist, neo-Nazi, misogynistic, anti-democratic scumbags. So like the two bases aren't equal, and yet it's the Republican base that gets all of the, at least deference, if not necessarily power, because as you mentioned, they don't really get anything except hatred.
You're hitting, Mary, on one of the most important things to me, and one of the reasons why I am a Democrat, or I'm a liberal, or wherever you want to label me, one of the reasons that I can be labeled as such. And it's because the things that I believe will help all people. Right? We can argue about whether or not I'm right. We can argue about whether or not I have the best way of helping all people. But I believe, and I have a credible argument to say, that if we do things in the ways that I think that we should do things, if we extend health care for everybody, if we control the police, if we extend voting rights to everybody, then everybody will benefit. Republicans so rarely have a credible argument for how their policies and the things that they want and they believe will actually help everybody. So yes, if you want to live in a Christian theocracy, then the Republicans, version of events will help you. But it doesn't much help you if you're Muslim. Whereas my version of religious freedom would help both Christians and Muslims at the same time, right? So Republicans have a debunked economic theory that will certainly help wealthy Americans, and maybe some of it, they argue somehow, even despite the facts, will trickle down to the middle class. But it's not going to help poor people. They don't even try to pretend that it's going to. They said they think the best thing to do about being poor is just to not be poor, right? To work harder, right? My economic theories, we can debate whether or not they would work, but my economic theories at least have a sense of how it would help poor people and middle class people, and rich people would still be like super rich and wealthy. And and not eaten by the proletariat, right? So like there are ways to skin this cat. So again, a big reason why I am who I am, why I'm part of the party I am, it's because I believe that even at the margins, our ideas are centered around the idea of helping everybody, whereas Republican ideas are centered around the idea of helping themselves.
Yeah. And, just to add on to that, it's not just that poor people just need to work harder, but according to Rick Scott, they also have to pay more taxes, which is somehow going to help them stop being poor.
Right. It's just, look, the two best articles that came out of the Trump era to me were Adam Serwer's The Cruelty is the Point, which just explains it. And Alexandra Petrie's I Like a Woman, but Not That Woman. Like, those are
yes, exactly.
Those are the two things that, explain late Republic America, I think, in the best way.
And you just said in that that the Republican Party is essentially a party that is policy free. and free of any substantive ideas that actually do anything. And yeah, I think you're right. I think people like Mitch McConnell, Bill Barr, they want to turn this country into a theocratic apartheid state. And if they get power again, they will. So that, to me, is a great segue to your book, because you spend much of it discussing the ways in which the Republicans talk about and defend the Constitution as being completely bullshit, for lack of a better term, and not to put too fine a point on it. So let's start here. The Constitution is trash, yes?
Right? I am so surprised that line has gotten so much attention in the press, considering the very first line of my book is "The Constitution is not good." And the very last line of my book is I'm here to tell you the Constitution is trash. Republicans are the one that says it always has to stay that way. So like the literal window, the frame of the book is around the premise that the Constitution is maybe not the best thing in the world. And Republicans are coming at me on Twitter like, did you see that this guy thinks the Constitution is trash? Yeah, I wrote a whole book about it. What's up?
But not just Republicans, it's like any white person. First of all, it's always lovely to know when somebody who's attacking your book has never read it. That's always fun. And secondly, it's always nice to know when people haven't actually read the Constitution or are not familiar with American history, because you make the case. I mean, it's. I think I tweeted about this. It's not just compelling; it's convincing. It's because it's true.
It's obvious, right? Like
it's born as trash. It's born in murder and enslavement and misogyny. So how could it not be? And this is actually, to me, one of the best and clearest through lines of your book. Even the amendments, even the way in which it has over time, to some degree or another, been improved. No women, no Black people, no minorities to any significant degree, if at all, have been involved in that process either.
Right. So like right. So we start from a original document that was written by slavers and colonists and, abolitionist white people who were nonetheless willing to make deals with slavers and colonists, right? Like that's the start, right? And then we have the Bill of Rights, which, remember, the founding fathers didn't even think were necessary, but they were kind of forced to politically, right? And we have this amendment process, and people always want to tell me, like, oh, but the amendment somehow saved or perfected or did whatever to the Constitution. But it's worth it to point out, I think, that the amendments themselves were written by exclusively white men to be ratified by almost exclusively white male legislatures, right? So, like, if you remember, like, you need 3/4 to amend the Constitution, pass the House and pass the Senate and be signed by the president and then ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures. So when you talk about the 14th Amendment, huge equal protection, due process for all, that was passed by a completely white Congress, passed by a completely white Senate, signed by a white president, ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures who were completely white at the time. That's your basis. And if you want to say like, oh, well, the Constitution has evolved and lived, and it's really about how we interpret the Constitution, which I agree, but then I have to bring up the fact that the Supreme Court calls itself the final arbiter on what the Constitution says, on what it actually means. I will note that power is not in the Constitution. That is a power that the Supreme Court just said it had. Everybody's like, okay.
Supreme Court's great that way.
Guess you guys get to decide. Guess the 9 unelected people get to decide, but whatever. So, but that's when it becomes important to say that we've had 115 Supreme Court justices in American history, and 108 of them have been white men. So, like, come on, folks. Like, it's not an actually controversial point to say that a document written by, for, and almost exclusively interpreted by and for white men is maybe not the best we can do as a starting point, right? So then, right, like just like, I don't think that's hard. When people are just are coming at me and just like, oh, but the Constitution, like what part of the Constitution are you defending to me, right? Like, what part are you willing to die for? Is it the part that says Wyoming has to have as much representation as 58 people in California? Is that the part that you're willing to go to the mattress for? Is it the part that says that we don't actually get to popularly elect the president? Is it the part that says that there are no term limits on Supreme Court justice? Like, is that the part you're willing? No. Most people will say, no, that's not the part they're willing to die for. They're willing to die for the concepts and the ideals of the Constitution, free speech and limited government and voting rights and universal suffrage and these things. That's the things that we're willing to die for. And I say, great, too bad. There has not been one day in American history where all of the ideals in the Constitution have been applied equally to everybody living here.
Yeah, especially when you have a bunch of Supreme Court justices who call themselves originalists, which should scare the shit out of everybody.
Who wants to go back to that? I don't.
No, I wrote a piece last year about how the Supreme Court, and this will not be any news to you, has been among the most anti-democratic institutions in this country's history. And I think right now we're faced with one of the worst. I mean, they're going to be, I think, when we look back, among the worst, up there with the Dred Scott court and the Plessy versus Ferguson court.
It's giving generational control of the Supreme Court to conservatives always goes wrong. It always ends badly, because what we've seen throughout American history is that when conservatives control the courts, there's nothing that you can do to stop them. There's no amendment that stops the Supreme Court from doing what it wants to do when it's controlled by conservatives. To prove that point, we had a whole civil war. I mean, we fought, bled, died, whatever. Got some amendments afterwards. One of them included the 15th Amendment, which said that all men were able to vote, regardless of race, color, or creed. Obviously, it took another, 60 years before women were allowed to vote, because, again, only white men got to write the things, got to write these amendments. The Supreme Court took that 15th Amendment, took that ideal that all men should be able to vote, and ignored it for 100 years. Right? They weren't going through a phase, all right? They just took that and they put it in a locker for 100 years. Then finally, we have another kind of civil uprising, the civil rights movement, right? And they finally say, okay, we'll let everybody vote. And in 40 years, we go from like an oppressed people to the first black president. And Republicans on the Supreme Court looked at that and be like, you know what we need to do? Take the 15th Amendment away again. And so before the first black president even got out of office, John Roberts, 2013, Shelby County v. Holder, eviscerates the Voting Rights Act, which is the act that makes the 15th Amendment real. Just takes it out at the knees. And that set the stage. It's the underreported part. More than the diners in Ohio, it is the evisceration of the 15th Amendment that set the stage for a narrow electoral college victory in 2016 for Donald Trump. And then we have 2021, where Roberts again just takes a hatchet to the 15th Amendment by eviscerating Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. So even when pressed, the first thing the Republican Supreme Court did is to take away voting rights. And it's people have to understand, this is happening. This happens this way on purpose, right? First, you take away voting rights before you take away abortion, which is what's coming this summer, right? Because if you take away abortion first, then people would just vote you out. So first you have to take away the voting rights, then you can take away abortion. Then you can go after all the vulnerable groups. And that's the process that's starting now. They're going after women this term. They will go after gays and lesbians next term. They will go after affirmative action and black people the term after that. Immigrants are being gone after the entire time. But it has to happen in sequence. You have to take away the voting rights first.
Yeah, and they're doing a really good job of it. And these things happen at times when those people have the luxury of not paying close enough attention, like during Reconstruction, for example, when the assumption is that things are getting better. Because on their face, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, yes, theoretically made things better. But that's not how it ended up, because if that had been true, then we wouldn't have had 100 years of Jim Crow and lynching and torturing and murdering and terrorizing black people who just wanted to exercise their right to vote. And we wouldn't have a situation now where everything is at stake, because we have not just extreme partisan gerrymandering that this grotesque Supreme Court just signed off on in Alabama, which I'm sure was a test case. We have voter suppression bills in 49 states that are going, most of which I'm sure will become law. And we have voter subversion. So it's this onslaught, and you're right. I think it is set up in this very systematic way. And it's so much of it's happening at the state level. And then when it's happening in the Supreme Court, I think people are like, oh, what are you going to do? It's the Supreme Court. Well, what can we do? Gee, is there something that can be done?
Well, before we get to
with
what
the
we
Supreme
can,
Court?
before we get to what we can do in the future, I just want to step back for a second because it's a really important. It's a big reason why I wrote the book, right? Because one of the pushbacks I've gotten is that, well, you're not going to convince a lot of conservatives with this. Man, that wasn't even my goal. My goal was to convince Democrats, because it is Democrats right now who won't take the field. Yeah. Republicans are constantly Republican-based voters, I do not believe, are smarter than Democratic-based voters, right? I don't think Republican-based voters know more about civics than Democrat-based voters. But Republican-based voters understand the importance of the Supreme Court because their leaders have been telling them that for a generation. So you can find a Republican-based voter who doesn't know jack about, civics or how a bill becomes the law or whatever, but knows that they need the Supreme Court if they want their guns, right?
Can I ask you a question in having to do this? Because it's always mystified me too. Not just why the Democrats haven't done it, but why they don't think it's necessary. Because if you look, the Supreme Court's everything. It's abortion rights, it's voting rights, it's climate change, it's the death penalty, it's civil rights, it's everything. So why is that? Why does that divide exist?
I think there are two reasons for it. One is because most people think of the Supreme Court as a liberal institution because of the Warren Court. Yeah. So they like you said it right. Like historically speaking, the Supreme Court has been one of the most conservative institutions in American life. But for like 20 years there, it was like super progressive. And it's like liberals are constantly living in if we just could get back to the Warren Court, everything would be fine, without truly understanding the conservative reactionary power of the Supreme Court traditionally. Right. So the Warren Court really kind of changed the eye level, I think, in an ultimately bad way in terms of Democrats truly understanding the importance of the court. That's number one. But the number two issue, and I believe this, it's harder for me to prove than the other thing, is that Democrats are afraid because they understand they don't want to defend some of these values and ideals as much as the Republicans want to attack it, right? So I think, for instance, a great version of that is to be found in the abortion debate. We can debate why Republicans are like this, but it's undeniable that there are Republicans who think that there is a baby Holocaust going on and that they are on some kind of holy crusade to stop it with these Supreme Court nominees. Meanwhile, you have Democrats who for a generation thought that the best thing to say was, well, abortion should be safe, legal, and rare. What's that? What's that? It's a Holocaust. You got safe, legal, and rare. What is that? How is that defending a woman's fundamental right to choose, which is really defending a woman's fundamental personhood? Where's that? And what you have is Democrats who are embarrassed to make the arguments that actually need to be made to defend the voting rights, right?
And using Republican language, saying pro-life and pro-life and pro-choice instead of pro-choice and anti-choice.
Right.
Like little things like that really matter, right?
Right. The Republicans call themselves pro-life. I call Republicans forced birth. Because that's what they're actually let's call what they're trying to do right? You're taking a woman who doesn't want to give birth and forcing her to do it against her will for no compensation. I don't need the 14th Amendment or the right to privacy. I need the 13th Amendment to stop that. But Democrats don't want to talk about it that way. Similarly, with voting rights, as much as we can say the base of the Democratic Party is black people, the base of the Democratic Party is black people, Democrats never want to believe that. They always want to believe that really they can win the white diner in Ohio. And so making the hard defense of voting rights always a little bit like, they'll do it, but it's not where their heart and passion is too often, right? So I think, certainly the LGBTQ issue, right? We had, again, Barack Obama. I love him. Black Jesus. Like, I love the guy. When he ran for office, I think marriage is between a man and a woman. He had to evolve on that, right? Republicans ain't need to evolve on what they thought
Or devolve,
about
as the
gay
case may be.
rights, right? So, like, the cultural issues that the Supreme Court deals with, Republicans are fundamentally much more comfortable making the cultural war points, and far too many white, male, centrist Democrats are afraid of getting in the trenches and fighting the culture war, which makes them afraid of getting in the trenches and fighting for the Supreme Court. So they end up saying things like, we just want good judges, without bothering to tell people what good judges do. Whereas Republicans are always willing to tell people what their judges are gonna do. That's the asymmetry.
Will refuse to do.
Right, and I think I hope that the younger generation will help us fight this, because if there are two things that I see coming from the millennials, which I can't even call kids anymore because I'm that old, right? Or Gen Zero, it's that they care about gun regulations and they care about the environment. And if Democrats could just show those kids that the one-to-one connection, that you're not going to get anything done with gun regulation unless you control the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is extreme even amongst Republicans when it comes to gun regulation. That you can't get anything with guns if you don't control the Supreme Court, and you can't get anything with the environment if you don't control the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court will not let businesses be hampered by environmental regulations if you don't control the Supreme Court. And if you could make the younger generation understand that, then you could start to develop a generation of liberally aligned single-issue voters in the Supreme Court, which is what you need to fight the battle with Republicans.
Yeah, and I think I could not agree more. The problem, though, is how do we get there, and can we get there? Because right now I feel like we all need to be single issue voters in the sense that we all need to be voting for democracy, such as it is. And I know it's awkward, but America's never been a democracy, so it's weird. I guess the way to put it is we need to be voting for the potential to have one someday. But the Democrats seem not to understand what's at stake. And that kind of blows my mind. And one of the things that I found, maybe demoralizing is too strong a word, but that I thought was a bad sign was the fact that a commission was put together to look into what's happening at the Supreme Court, and should there be an ethics something,
we're so behind the times. So like the ultimate solution is that we need to expand the number of justices on the Supreme Court. That 9 is it's not from the Constitution. We started with 6, went to 7, up to 10 at one point. 9 is not a sacred number. That 9, you could argue, is changing the justices on the Supreme Court and the number of justices on the Supreme Court is the constitutionally preferred method of dealing with the court that's out of touch. The Constitution specifies that they're there for life. They don't want them politically pressured. Now that's a whole different. That's an amendment that I would make. But the Constitution specifies that they have to be there for life, but it doesn't specify how many they have to be. Right. And so expanding the Supreme Court, and again, I argue not in a tit for tat, let's do, they stole 2, let's put on 4 more. Like go 20, 30 people would actually be better for democracy, because what it would do would keep the Supreme Court kind of as powerful as it is, but lessen the power of each individual justice. That's number one. And then number two, as I've said many times, look, you can't do anything on the Supreme Court without 5 votes, right? But if you've ever tried to get like 5 people together for a night out, I mean, you'll end up in some places, right? You'll end up at Thunder Down Under if you only need to get 5 people, right? You'll go, right? If you need to get 15 people together, you're going to end up at Applebee's. You're going to end
Yeah,
up at the
that's
Olive
actually
Garden.
really,
You're going to end up with more
yeah.
moderate mainstream decisions if you expand the number of people who have to like be in favor of that decision. So a 29 person court where you need to get 15 people to get a majority is just going to fundamentally be more American center mass mainstream than a 9 person court where you just need to get you and 4 of your crazy friends to go along with you, right? So like that, there are reform issues here beyond the tit for tat Republican Democrat politics. But if
Yeah.
you want to go the tit for tat Republican Democrat politics, one of the things that people always push back with me when I talk about court expansion, they're like, well, what if Republicans expand it back? So
So what?
how is
It's the
that?
same thing with the filibuster.
How is that?
Yeah, the Republicans might get rid of it. Okay, fine. So let's get rid of the fucking filibuster and do
How
something.
is that worse where we are now? If you
Yeah.
expand the court, if you do these things, if you reform democracy, you end the filibuster, you expand the court, you protect voting rights. What you have is a situation where it's much harder for Republicans to take control of all of government again. Because the only way that Republicans win at this point is by suppressing or ignoring or finding some other ways to get around the majority of the American people. The Republicans are losing. They've lost
Yeah.
7 of the last 8 presidential elections when it comes to popular vote. They've lost I don't know how many in a row, but they consistently lose the popular vote in the midterm elections. Overall, they win through gerrymandering and through minority control.
It's been everyone since George W. Bush's second.
Is that it? So like
Yep.
that's a long time, right? Like if you make it so that everybody who wants to vote can vote, and all of those votes are counted, and all of those districts are drawn fairly. If you do that, it becomes extremely hard for Republicans to take control of all government again.
Which is why they're so desperate, obviously.
Because they have
I mean, fighting so hard
no
because they're
argument,
desperate.
right? And
They're
I've said this
cheating so
before,
hard.
but it's
Yeah.
it's always weird to me. Like, look, I know I come off as like crazy liberal progressive guy, but that there's also like I'm a 43-year-old man with a wife and 2 kids and a mortgage that lives in the suburbs, and y'all Republicans can't make an argument for me. Like,
That's right.
y'all,
Exactly.
y'all can't make just a basic self-interested argument for me because you literally cannot go through an entire election cycle without keeping your racism in your mouth. Like that's how bad you've gotten. Like the extent to which the Republicans are only playing to a white supremacist rump of this country is kind of mind-boggling. And the best way to, all these never Trump Republicans, the best way to break the Republican Party out of that is by forcing them to compete on a national stage. Because if they had to compete for everybody, they couldn't harbor these extreme positions that they have.
Yeah, but I also think they've come to the conclusion that they don't need to do that because they're just going to game the system.
Exactly.
They're going to keep gaming the system and gaming the system. Somebody once asked me, why don't they seem to care that Trumpism, so-called, doesn't scale? I'm like, because they don't need for it to. If they only need 33% of the vote to win a national election, what the hell do they need to change anything for?
I honestly thought after Romney lost, what that proved was that there wasn't enough of a white supremacist base left in the country to support a Republican national candidate. And boy, was I wrong. Like, boy, was I like that. That was where I made the wrong turn to Albuquerque. I didn't think there were so many of them there. And Republicans, apparently, they always knew they had more. They just needed to go get them. Go motivate them. And that's what they knew, and I didn't know. And we're living in the consequences of that, right?
We are indeed. So let's talk about something slightly less depressing. Actually, something wonderful. The nomination of Ketanji Jackson. Thank God I didn't call her Jackson Brown. Sorry. I'm sure I'm not the only person who's been having that. But Ketanji Brown Jackson, Jesus. She seems to me, the only criticism I have is that she's not 40.
Right.
Or 12 would be better. I can't think of a better nominee. And yet, the Republicans, even the ones who've voted for her to elevate her to other positions on other courts, will probably not vote for her this time around. What? I mean, I know we can't worry about Republican hypocrisy. It kind of goes without saying at this point. But what else needs to happen to force a conversation about substance? Like it's just non-existent on the other side. And, we have this spectacularly qualified woman who has more experience than 4 out of the 9 people currently serving on the court. And her qualifications are being questioned and maligned. I mean, I'm not surprised. Don't get me wrong. I'm not surprised. But that doesn't mean I can't be horrified,
Look, Mary, I've been on both sides of this. I have been on the side of defending Supreme Court nominees. I have been on the side of attacking Supreme Court nominees. Let's talk about me on the attack, right? When I come to attack, I come with cases. I come with law review articles. I come with speeches. I come with substance. I come with facts about what these people have said or done, decisions these people have made, and let's go and let's talk about what they've actually done in their lives or in their careers. Republicans for Brown Jackson right now got nothing. They don't got a case. They don't got a note.
What are her LSAT scores?
They're coming at her with literally asking her about her law school entrance exam because the 40 years of her career they have nothing to say about, right? It would be interesting to me if they could pull out a case that she decided where they disagree with her opinion. Because I'm still waiting. I've read them. I'm waiting to see them read them and tell me exactly where they disagree, right? Even the things that they have said to her, said about her opinion so far, they've amounted to she stood against the Trump administration. Yes, so did almost everybody in the legal system, right? Yes, she disagreed with Trump's cockamamie legal arguments, right? So that's not going to be it. I've read cases from her where she's defending cops. I've read cases from her where she's defending plaintiffs who are criticizing cops who have gone completely off the reservation. I'm waiting for Republicans to come with a case. So when I know they won't because that's not what they do on that side of the aisle. But the lack of actual substantive disagreements with her record is really jarring to me especially after the last few nominees, where we had cases up and down on Amy Coney Barrett of I have a problem with how she ruled here. I have a problem with how she ruled here. Brett Kavanaugh, I mean, don't even want to get into I'm talking with Brown Jackson about the professional qualifications. I don't even need to get into her moral qualifications, which she also has, that other people in the Republican Party have not, right? And, Neil Gorsuch, one of the biggest things about Neil Gorsuch was besides his yearbook photo where he was part of the fascist club as a joke,
it's hysterical.
Was his frozen trucker case, right? Where people remember the frozen trucker case. So where's the frozen trucker case for Ketanji Brown Jackson? At the very least, give me that version of the frozen trucker case so we can have something that's real to talk about as opposed to these just blatantly racist attacks that they're making against her. So that's why I've been saying, you've probably heard me say this before, I actually do not think this confirmation battle will be all that difficult. I mean, it'll be bad, they'll throw dirt, and they'll clown themselves. But at the end of the day, I think she's getting confirmed. I don't even think it's going to be that hard.
Yeah, I don't think they're going to lay a glove on her, and I do think it will be bipartisan, which in this day and age means 1 or 2 Republicans. Well, I mean, Lindsey Graham won't because he's Lindsey Graham, but the other 2 or 3 Republicans who've voted for her in the past, I think, will again. It's just another chance, though, for them to show us who they are. Not that we need any more proof of this, but it's I don't know.
I think what's and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think what we're both kind of getting at, it's so embarrassing for them because this one would be easy. This would be this costs them nothing. She's immensely qualified, and she doesn't change the balance of the court. It would cost them nothing to just be like, oh yeah, that's fine. Anyway, moving on. Let's talk about gas prices. Like, whatever. Like, this is a layup for them. And even then they can't take the layup. They can't take yes for an answer. Because she's a woman, because she's black, because they have their hang-ups, right? And because like the success of a black woman like threatens them in their little, in their little brains. So like you've got Tucker Carlson talking about test scores. It's amazing when it'd be so easy to just be like, okay, yeah, you got this one. Anyway, moving on.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, and honestly, if I could remember my GRE scores, I'd be embarrassed. I have no idea what my GRE scores are. It would be embarrassing. I know we're running out of time, but I have a couple more questions. Is that okay?
Sure.
Because I asked people to send in questions, and
I got a bunch. We didn't get to any of them. All right.
Yeah, for the sake of time, there's one in particular I wanted to ask because I think it's a great way to start wrapping up. From Teresa. I believe Elie said that it would not be possible in our present day to have a constitutional convention, but let's pretend that we could. In a perfect world, who from our public sphere would he assign as a delegate for the new constitution? And one of the reasons I like that question is because it's like hopeful, and it kind of gets us out of the dire straits we're in when like feels like nothing's going to be accomplished ever, but it also gives us something to work towards, because I agree with you. We need to rewrite the Constitution from the ground up, or just give us the First and the 14th Amendment, which is something else I wanted to talk to you about, but that's a much longer conversation. So what do you think about Teresa's question? Okay,
so in the perfect world where Republicans don't exist, well, obviously it's not just a delegate, right? The whole point is that, to quote Kermit the Frog in Muppets Take Manhattan, you want more dogs and cats and bears and chickens and things. Like you want as many diverse people as possible, because nobody has a monopoly on knowing what to do, and nobody has a monopoly on rights and responsibilities, right? So you'd want to make sure, whatever it was, you want to make sure there was at least 50% women, right? That's what the world is at the very least, right? So you'd want to have 50% women. You'd want to have representative minority representation across as many groups as possible. You'd want some openly LGBTQ folks in there. You want people whose rights are on the line or on the chopping block all the time to have a participation in making those rights. There is no one person who could do it. I wouldn't want to do. I mean, like I could do it as a joke, but like I wouldn't. I'll put it like this, Mary. I would not vote for a constitution that I wrote myself. Because the simple idea that only one person would be in charge of writing it is an anathema to the entire project that I'm trying to talk about.
Sure. I mean, I have to assume that wasn't, that was maybe
so then just for funsies though, who's got that like idea?
Pick a few people, not just one, but like, a small group of people you think would be a really good starting point.
Okay, well, I'll start this way. So I had Justice Elena Kagan in college. She's one of my professors. I put her in there. I would put Elizabeth Warren in there, who was not one of my professors, because I was scared of her class, and I didn't need that kind of heat on my transcript there at the end. I was just trying to get out, right?
That's great.
So I definitely start with those two as the core, as a great core. And then since I've just been talking about Ketanji Brown Jackson so much and how great I think she is, I put her in there too. So I'm starting with 3 women, and the other people can add in their heroes. But I think that with those 3 women, that would be a great core. Kagan's a little bit more rules based. Jackson really has that sense of like how people live in this society, and Warren for just that, like, what's not going to happen. Adam Smith is not writing this Constitution. Like that aspect, I think that's a great core.
Right. Oh man, I love that. I would, because I'm less forgiving, I would say no white guys, but maybe I could change my mind.
You had your chance, white guys. Yeah.
You did. You had your chance and you really blew it.
Right.
Like from A to Z, you blew it.
Steve Kerr, Golden State Warriors basketball coach. Steve Kerr, or San Antonio Spurs coach Greg Popovich. Those are my white guys.
I'm going to have to defer you because I don't know who either of those people is, but I trust you. So that's cool with me too. I'm going to start this list. I'm going to keep track of this list, and every time I have somebody else on who knows what they're talking about, I'm going to ask them
Okay.
because I think it could be. It's a good thought exercise. Two more really quick questions that I like to ask everybody because we're living. You may have noticed in dark times. Yeah, it's overwhelming, almost always. So especially when you have kids. So what now gives you hope? And how do you hang on to it, considering everything?
Rum and no.
Oh, I'd say vodka, but okay. Rum's good.
Hope. This is going to be dark, but this is where I am this
Okay.
week. Republicans are on the verge of getting everything they wanted, and sometimes that's the worst thing that can happen to a person, right? So sometimes the worst thing
Yeah.
that can happen is when you get everything you want. So I guess a version of hope that I have is that as Republicans collect their victories, as they overturn abortion rights and they unleash guns on our subway systems and they overturn public health and safety regulations and they get all these things that they wanted, maybe more people will realize that living in a Republican dystopian theocracy is bad and will rise up and do something about it, right? Because I think that you try to explain to people what Republicans are trying to do, and there's a part of them that like doesn't believe you. Like that just
Right.
doesn't believe they're going to go as far as they're going to go. But when they're putting, kidnapping trans kids from their families, when they are jailing parents who get their daughters birth control pills, when all that's happening, maybe people will realize that we weren't being hysterical all along, and will do something to stop them. Does that count as hope?
Yeah.
It's definitely it might get darker before it gets lighter, but I do think it'll get
Yeah.
lighter because I do think that ultimately, they're destined to lose. Ultimately, people don't want to live under a theocratic dystopia, and so I do think that people will eventually figure that out.
Well, we have a test case. I think Texas is almost entirely on its way. Maybe not completely, but it's getting there. I mean, women are now second-class citizens, or people who want to decide whether or not to be pregnant. They have, there's this new anti-trans thing
Kidnapping
where
bill.
it's also a vigilante system, as it is with the anti-abortion situation. And their new voting rights laws they're so egregious that the Department of Justice is looking into them. And I think for a long time now, Texas is that place. Anybody at any time, at all times, can have whatever kind of gun they want with as big a magazine as they want. So I think Texas is pretty close. So we'll have to see how the next elections down there go, because that could be an indicator.
Or we'll see if
perhaps.
people start fleeing. Like
Right.
at some point you got to move out, right? Like I'm kind of waiting for and we haven't really seen this yet. I'm really waiting for the business community to also like start being like, we're not gonna do this anymore. We're not gonna have our workers go here anymore. We're not there yet, but
Yeah.
we'll
No.
we'll see if we get there.
All right. Well, I hope you're right. It's hard to have faith in American corporations.
I mean, you're in trouble when that's what you're hoping for, right? Maybe
You're
Coca-Cola will. I mean, like that's
yeah. I mean, Coke, Starbucks, and McDonald's won't leave Russia, for God's sake. So
right.
Disney won't do anything in Florida. So, but I guess corporations are people too. So
They're made up of people. What was the second question? You said you had two to close.
Just how do you hang on to hope in this day and age?
The hanging on to it is different. I've got to hang on to it because I've got two kids, right? I've got a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old. And I've got to hope that their lives will be better than they look right now. Although I will say, and I've talked about this before, that I like one of the problems in my education, my self-perceived problems in my education is that I never had any kind of international skills, right? Like I need to be like north of the Mason-Dixon line, east of the Hudson, south of Montreal. Like there I'm okay. And once I go beyond there, I'm a little bit out of my element, right? I don't know how to speak another language, like most intelligent people know how to do, right? So like all these things, I really don't want my kids to be like that. Because I really want my kids to have the ability, the option, to get out of here if that's what becomes.
Yeah, I'm trying to get my daughter a Scottish passport.
You know what I'm saying? Just in case, because you never know. Like maybe it's. I would love for them to have that ability, that cultural flexibility that maybe I myself don't have. But fundamentally, yeah, I have to keep some hope because I got them to care about and to worry about.
Right. And they do control the iPads in your house.
Absolutely.
So
right.
Elie Mystal, this has been such a pleasure. I've been wanting to meet you for a long time, and I'm glad your book gave me an excuse. It's again, allow me to retort. Can you see that? A Black Guy's Guide to the Constitution. Seriously, it's necessary. It is a corrective to almost all of the history white people have been, quote unquote, taught, which is why you're seeing the reactions you're seeing from white people to a lot of this book. On Twitter, somebody told me that we were race baiting because we don't think the Constitution is good. I'm like, that's an interesting take. Right? But anyway, the book is fantastic. Please read it and read Elie's stuff in The Nation. And obviously, he's a contributor on MSNBC who really needs to be paid. Elie, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, Mary.
Okay, now we come to the point in the show where I get to answer your questions. I really like hearing from you. So if you have a question for me, please send an email to mary@politicon.com, and I will try to get to all of the questions you send me in the next show. So first up, we have a question from Tim in Barcelona, Spain. Tim asks, have you ever known a person as psychologically troubled as Donald? And have they ever had a moment when they say, that's it, I can't do this anymore, I'm exhausted, I'm full of shit, and I'm so sorry for everything? Is a Damascene conversion theoretically even possible for someone as unwell as he is? Well, first of all, I worked on the admissions ward of a state psychiatric hospital, so I've definitely met people who are more psychologically disordered than Donald is. That having been said, he's more dangerous, obviously, because he's been given ridiculous amounts of power that somebody like him never should have had. And as for his ever coming to some realization that his entire existence is a lie, this will never happen because he's a malignant narcissist, and narcissists narcissists at that level never come to any real understanding of who they are because it would completely shatter their illusions. And that is much of what Donald spends his psychic energy defending against, actually. From Julie in Burlingame, California. Do you think it's possible to enact laws to prevent dangerous people from holding any public office without it being framed by the right wing as discriminatory or stigmatizing mental illness? I don't think laws can be enacted, actually. I think, basically, under the Constitution, anybody who wants to run for office can run for office. So the only way to prevent a disaster like Donald is for the parties to come up with vetting processes. For example, so at any time along the way, the Republican Party could have torpedoed Donald's nomination simply by requiring that all candidates release their tax returns, or a full medical or psychiatric workup. I think both parties should do some version of that. I think tax returns should be a requirement, as should a full battery of psychological and psychiatric tests and a full medical workup by a nonpartisan committee of doctors, psychiatrists, psychologists, neurologists. I think candidates for president or for the nomination should be able to demonstrate that they've actually read the Constitution. However, since it's up to the parties, I don't think that would ever happen on the Republican side. So, unfortunately, we're going to be stuck with somebody like Donald again, potentially. Okay, so here's a question from Logan in Texas, who asks, who are your go-tos for reliable information about Ukraine and the Russian aggression against Ukraine? There are a few, actually, but just generally speaking, I will listen to anything Fiona Hill has to say on the subject. Alexander Vindman, Michael McFaul, they all have immense amounts of experience, have lived over there, speak the language, or languages, as the case may be. So, especially since there's so much, it's so awful, and we all want to do something. And there's, other than donating, which is a great thing to do, don't get me wrong, but, we can't really make a difference in the conflict. So there's this real anxiety that we're not doing enough, that we should be doing more militarily. And I completely understand that. But, those three people I mentioned, and others as well, really understand NATO's position. They understand what NATO's been dealing with for the last 4 decades. They grew up during the Cold War, as did I. And, especially during the very serious nuclear tensions that existed in the 80s. So when the subject of, say, a no-fly zone comes up, or establishing a no-fly zone, which is really a euphemism for let's shoot Russian planes out of the sky zone, right? I'm going to listen to what they say. And if they think it's not a good idea and that we should be doing more in terms of giving Ukraine money and weaponry, I will absolutely defer to them because I don't know anything about it. All of my information about this, I try to get from experts, so that my opinion at least is informed. So I would definitely listen to Fiona Hill, Alex Vindman, Michael McFaul. I mean, there are many others, but those have been my 3 go-tos. So, okay, for the last question, Kathy in New York asks, if World War III breaks out, who would you choose to be in a bunker with? Well, the first person I choose to be in a bunker with is my daughter. And then I would choose Jen Taub, Katie Fang, E. Jean Carroll, Marissa Rothkopf, and Joyce Vance, which is really very convenient because starting this Thursday at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, this show is going live on the Politicon channel at YouTube. And those 5 are my first guests because my daughter's in the middle of midterm, so she can't join us. Anyway, please come join us at 7 o'clock this Thursday on YouTube, the Politicon YouTube channel. And like I said, it's going to be live. As usual, if you have any questions, please send them to me at mary@politicon.com, and I'll get to as many of them as I can. I love hearing from you guys, so definitely send me an email with your questions. And thank you for joining me for our last recorded show. And I will see you all live this coming Thursday, March 10th at 7 o'clock p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you so much for joining me today. Thank you so much to Elie Mystal for being such a great guest. And I will see you in a couple of days. Stay safe.